I bought a shack to bury my past, but the lonely widow next door made me want to live again. Ethan had always thought that life would offer him more than it did. As a young man, he had dreams that reached far beyond the small town where he was born. He imagined traveling the world, building a career that would make a difference, and someday having a family that would bring warmth to his home. But life had a way of quietly twisting dreams into something unrecognizable. The divorce, the fights he could not win, the harsh words he regretted almost every day, they had taken their toll. Even his career, once a source of pride, had ended in disappointment, leaving him wondering if he had wasted years chasing something that would never last. For months, Ethan had felt like he was walking through a fog. Days blurred into nights, and nothing seemed worth the effort. He stayed in his apartment, staring at walls that seemed to shrink closer every day. Friends reached out, but he would politely decline invitations, not because he disliked them, but because every social interaction reminded him of the laughter he once shared and the silence that followed after it was gone. Even simple things like cooking dinner or watching a movie had lost their charm. It felt as if life had become a series of routines that existed only to pass time. One evening, sitting alone in the dim light of his apartment, Ethan realized he needed to escape. He couldn't keep living surrounded by reminders of failure and loss. He didn't want to run from his problems. He knew that running would not solve anything, but he needed a place where he could be alone with his thoughts, where no one would ask him questions he didn't want to answer. That night, he began searching for a small house, a shack, or even an old cabin somewhere far from the city, somewhere quiet, somewhere that didn't carry memories of the life he had left behind. It didn't take long for him to find what he was looking for. The shack was small and weathered, sitting at the edge of a forest in a quiet countryside. The wooden walls were worn with age, the paint peeling and the roof sagged slightly, as if it had borne the weight of many winters. The land around it was overgrown with tall grass and wildflowers, and a small stream ran nearby. It was not luxurious, and it was not perfect, but it was exactly what Ethan needed. A place that had no ties to his past. He felt a strange excitement as he signed the papers. For the first time in months, he imagined a life that didn't feel like it was slipping through his fingers. Moving day arrived with an air of nervous anticipation. Ethan loaded a few essentials into his car, clothes, some books, a few personal items, and drove away from the city he had once called home. The journey was long, the winding roads surrounded by forests that seemed endless, but for Ethan, each mile felt like a small victory. He was leaving behind the city's noise, its memories, and its reminders of what he had lost. Here, at last, he could be alone with himself, and perhaps, in time, find peace. When he first arrived at the shack, Ethan took a long moment just to look at it. The windows were dusty and the door creaked loudly when he opened it. The floorboards groaned under his weight, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. But to him, it was perfect. It was a blank canvas, a place where he could slowly rebuild a life without judgment, without expectations. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of control over the space, over his surroundings, and maybe, in some small way, over his future. The first few days were quiet, almost eerily so. Ethan spent his time cleaning, repairing small things, and arranging his few belongings. He discovered that the shack had a charm that he hadn't expected. The sunlight poured through the windows in the morning, casting warm patterns across the wooden floor. Birds sang outside in the trees, and the stream's gentle murmur was a soothing soundtrack to his solitude. He took long walks along the narrow dirt paths, exploring the nearby woods and fields. In those moments, he felt a rare calm. For the first time in years, the constant anxiety and regret that had followed him like shadows seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet stillness he hadn't known he needed. But solitude, Ethan quickly realized, was a double-edged sword. At first, the silence was comforting, a relief from the chaos of his previous life. But as the days passed, the quiet began to feel heavy. There were moments when he would sit on the porch, staring at the horizon, and feel a deep ache in his chest. It was not loneliness in the usual sense, but a reminder of everything he had left behind. Memories would sneak in, uninvited. Laughter with old friends, the gentle touch of someone who had once meant the world, the excitement of a career he had loved. Each memory was a mixture of warmth and pain, and Ethan found himself struggling to push them away. Even so, he told himself that this was necessary. He needed to face his past alone, to let go of the guilt, regret, and sorrow that had accumulated over the years. The shack was more than just a building. It was a symbol of a chance to start over, a place where he could bury the weight of his history, and, perhaps, find a small measure of peace. He spent hours reflecting, writing in a journal, and thinking about the choices he had made. Some thoughts were painful, some bittersweet, but all of them were honest. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt that he was confronting life head-on, even if it was in the quiet solitude of a remote shack. The evenings were the hardest. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the world turned dark, the silence of the countryside pressed in on him. There were no sounds of traffic, no chatter of neighbors, no familiar city hum to distract him. The only noises were the wind through the trees, the occasional rustle of an animal, and the slow trickle of the stream. On some nights, Ethan would sit outside, staring at the stars, and feel both insignificantly small and profoundly alive. He realized how much of his life he had spent ignoring the quiet beauty around him, always focused on the next task, the next problem, the next regret. Now, here, he had nothing but time and space to think, and it was both liberating and terrifying. Despite the occasional pangs of loneliness, Ethan began to appreciate the simplicity of his new life. He cooked simple meals, watered the small garden that had survived previous neglect, and spent hours reading or sketching the landscape. He found joy in small accomplishments, like fixing a leaking roof or clearing a path through the overgrown grass. Each day he felt a small sense of progress, not in terms of wealth or success, but in the sense that he was rebuilding himself, piece by piece. The shack, once just a place to hide, was slowly becoming a home. One afternoon, while walking near the stream, Ethan noticed the faint outline of another house in the distance. It was small and well kept, surrounded by a tidy garden. He had not expected anyone to live nearby, and a strange curiosity stirred within him. Who lived there? What was their life like? But he quickly pushed the thought away. He was here for himself, he reminded himself, not to get involved with anyone else's story. Still, a small part of him could not ignore the feeling that life might still have surprises in store, even in a place designed for solitude. As the first week turned into the second, Ethan began to feel a subtle shift in himself. The shack, the quiet, the isolation, it was working. He was learning to be comfortable with his own company, to face his thoughts without flinching. He started to dream again, not in grandiose ways, but small, realistic hopes. Planting a proper garden, fixing the old porch, perhaps even reading every book he had neglected over the years. The shack was no longer just a refuge from the past. It was a place where he could rediscover parts of himself that he thought had been lost forever. And yet, there was an undeniable emptiness, a quiet echo that reminded him of the life he had left behind. It was a feeling that sometimes made his chest ache and his eyes sting with unshed tears. But Ethan had made a choice. He had chosen solitude, not as punishment, but as a way to heal. And even in the darkest moments of that first month, he felt a faint glimmer of hope, a promise that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to live fully again. Ethan had come to the shack to bury his past, to disappear from the world that had disappointed him so much. But as he watched the wind rustle through the trees, heard the stream gurgle happily along its path, and felt the sunlight warm his shoulders, he realized that even in solitude, life could offer small moments of peace. He didn't yet know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time he felt ready to face it. And deep down he sensed that his life might not end in this quiet shack. Perhaps in ways he could not yet imagine, this place would be the beginning of something new. Ethan had settled into a quiet routine at the shack. The days passed slowly but peacefully, filled with small tasks like fixing the roof, tending to the overgrown yard, and exploring the woods nearby. The silence that once felt heavy was now comforting, like a soft blanket wrapping around him after years of cold and noise. Yet even in this solitude, his mind was not completely at rest. There were moments, usually in the late afternoon when the sunlight painted golden streaks across the fields, that he would glance toward the faint outline of the house nearby. The house was not far, perhaps a few hundred meters away, but it seemed almost untouched by time. Its wooden walls were painted a gentle shade of cream, and the roof, though old, appeared sturdy. The garden in front was neatly kept, with rows of flowers, vegetables, and herbs. A small path of stones led to the front door, and a swing hung from a large tree in the yard. Ethan had not expected anyone to live so close, and yet here it was, a house full of life in the middle of his quiet exile. It was during one of his early evening walks that he saw her for the first time. She was older, perhaps in her late 50s or early 60s, with soft, silver-streaked hair tied back in a loose bun. She moved slowly but deliberately, carrying a basket filled with vegetables she had picked from her garden. Her face, though marked by age and loss, carried a gentle warmth that immediately caught Ethan's attention. There was something in the way she worked, methodical, patient, and quietly resilient, that made her presence feel alive, yet unobtrusive. Ethan felt a strange pull toward the widow next door, though he did not know her name. He reminded himself that he was here to be alone, to bury his past, and yet he found himself curious. He watched discreetly from behind a tree, pretending to admire the view of the fields while stealing glimpses of her daily routines. She watered the plants carefully, humming a tune that sounded soft and cheerful. Occasionally, she would pause, look toward the sky, and smile as if sharing a secret with the sun itself. It was a small, private happiness that seemed untouched by the hardships of life. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's curiosity grew. He began noticing small details, the way she swept the porch in the morning, the way she talked to the animals that wandered near her yard, even the way she paused to adjust her scarf when the wind blew. Each observation added layers to his impression of her. She was not someone who demanded attention or recognition, yet her presence had a gentle influence on the world around her. Ethan felt something stir inside him, a long-forgotten feeling of connection, of admiration, and, strangely, hope. Despite his growing interest, Ethan remained cautious. He had come to the countryside to escape, not to engage with anyone. His past had taught him that connections were complicated and often painful. People could leave, betray, or disappoint, and he was not sure he could face that again. Yet each time he saw her, a quiet sense of longing grew. It was not romantic at first. It was simply an awareness that life could still hold moments of beauty and kindness, even for someone like him, who had been broken by loss. One afternoon, as he was returning from a walk through the nearby woods, Ethan noticed the widow struggling to carry her basket of vegetables up the small hill from the garden. She stumbled slightly, and the contents of the basket threatened to spill. Without thinking, Ethan called out, "Do you need some help?" The woman looked up, surprised, her hands clinging to the basket. Then, with a small appreciative smile, she said, "Oh, thank you. That would be very kind of you." Ethan approached, and together they carried the basket to her porch. The interaction was simple, polite, and entirely without pressure. Yet for Ethan, it was significant. It was the first conversation he had had with another human being in weeks, and it felt strangely alive. Her voice was soft but steady, and the warmth in her eyes made him realize how long it had been since anyone had truly looked at him with kindness rather than expectation. Over the next few days, their paths crossed more often. Sometimes it was exchanging brief greetings while fetching water or collecting firewood. Other times it was helping her with small tasks, moving a heavy bag of soil for her garden, or repairing a broken gate hinge. Each encounter was simple, practical, and safe, yet each one chipped away at the walls Ethan had built around himself. He found himself looking forward to these moments, to the quiet presence of someone who did not judge, who simply existed with him in the same world. Through these small interactions, Ethan began learning bits of her story. He discovered her name was Margaret, and that she had lived in the countryside for most of her life. Her husband had passed away several years ago, leaving her alone in the house she loved. She spoke rarely of the grief, but her actions revealed resilience. She cared for the garden, tended to the animals, and maintained her home with dedication. There was a quiet strength in her, a determination to live fully despite the loneliness that had entered her life. Ethan found himself inspired. Margaret's life, though marked by loss, was far from empty. She had created routines, found joy in simple things, and embraced solitude with dignity. In watching her, Ethan began to see a reflection of what he could become. If she could continue forward despite her hardships, perhaps he too could find a way to face life without being consumed by regret. It was a lesson he had not expected to learn from a stranger. One rainy morning, Ethan found himself at her doorstep, delivering a small basket of fresh bread he had baked. He had intended it as a kind gesture, a way to acknowledge her quiet friendliness. Margaret welcomed him with a warm smile, and for the first time their conversation extended beyond practical matters. They spoke of the weather, of the changing seasons, of books and stories they enjoyed. Ethan realized that the shack had not only offered him solitude but had opened a door to unexpected human connection. The days continued in this rhythm. Ethan would tend to his own tasks in the shack, while keeping an eye on Margaret from a respectful distance. He observed how she laughed quietly when a bird landed near her porch, how she hummed while working in the garden, and how she paused to watch the sunset in the evenings. These small, ordinary moments began to mean something to him. They reminded him that life was still happening around him, even in the quiet countryside, and that there was beauty to be found if he was willing to notice it. Ethan also began noticing his own changes. He felt lighter in the mornings, more motivated to maintain the shack and the land around it. The weight of past failures, though still present, no longer pressed down on him as heavily. He found himself smiling quietly at small things, the way sunlight danced on the stream, the smell of fresh soil after rain, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind.
Margaret, without even trying, had become a part of this transformation.
Her existence reminded him that life could be gentle, and that connection, even the simplest kind, could awaken something long dormant in his heart. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Ethan and Margaret happened to walk near the edge of the woods together. A stray dog had wandered near, and they worked side by side to guide it back to its home. It was a small, shared task, but in that moment, the silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. Ethan realized that he was no longer merely observing Margaret from a distance. He was part of the same world, experiencing life alongside another person who had endured hardship and yet continued to live with grace. By the end of the month, Ethan's perspective had begun to shift. The shack, which he had once thought of as a refuge from life, was no longer a place solely for hiding. It had become a place where he could see life in new ways, where he could notice beauty, resilience, and kindness without being overwhelmed by his own regrets. Margaret had not changed her routines for him. She had simply lived her life, yet her existence had a profound impact on him. She had reminded him, without even trying, that the world was full of small joys and quiet strength, and that even a life scarred by loss could find moments of meaning and connection. Ethan did not yet know what the future held. He did not yet know if he would fully embrace life again, or if the solitude he had sought would always be necessary. But for the first time since arriving at the shack, he felt that he could face tomorrow with a sense of calm, curiosity, and even hope. Margaret, the widow next door, had awakened something inside him he thought had been lost forever. The belief that life, despite its hardships, was still worth living. And as the evening fell and the first stars appeared in the sky, Ethan sat quietly on the porch of his shack, listening to the stream and the distant rustle of leaves, feeling the subtle but undeniable stirrings of a life that might one day be full again. He had come to bury his past, but in the presence of the quiet, resilient woman next door, he had begun to see the first signs of something new, something that whispered of connection, renewal, and the possibility of joy once more. Ethan had grown accustomed to the rhythm of his days at the shack. He woke with the sun, worked on small repairs, tended to the overgrown yard, and took long walks in the surrounding fields and woods. The quiet had become a companion, and he began to feel a sense of peace he had not known in years. Yet Margaret, the widow next door, had become more than just a curious presence in his days. She had become a subtle, quiet force in his life, one he could not ignore. It was a crisp morning when the first true interaction occurred, beyond the polite greetings and small gestures. Margaret had been carrying a large basket of firewood from the forest, her hands trembling slightly under the weight. Ethan, who had been walking nearby collecting kindling for his own stove, noticed her struggling and approached without thinking. "Here," he said, offering to take part of the load. "Let me help you." Margaret looked up, surprised for a moment, and then gave a small smile that seemed to carry the weight of years of solitude and hardship. "Thank you," she said softly. "I wasn't expecting help today." Together, they carried the wood to her porch, chatting quietly along the way. Ethan learned that she had been managing her home and garden alone since her husband's passing. She spoke openly about her routines, the challenges of maintaining the land, and her small joys, like seeing the first bloom in spring or the song of a bird she particularly liked. Ethan listened intently, fascinated not just by her words, but by the calm and strength that seemed to radiate from her. For Ethan, this simple act of helping Margaret was more than just a physical task. It was a bridge, a connection that he had not realized he was longing for. He felt a warmth he had not experienced in a long time, a feeling that life could still offer meaningful interactions even after years of disappointment and grief. The awkwardness he had felt in social situations months ago had melted away, replaced by the ease of working alongside someone who simply existed without pretense or judgment. Over the next few days, their interactions became more frequent. Ethan found himself noticing her from afar less and less. Instead, he began seeking moments to be near her in small, practical ways. Sometimes it was helping her fix a loose gate hinge. Other times it was carrying water from the stream or repairing a section of her garden fence. Each task was ordinary, yet each encounter allowed Ethan to see a side of life he had long forgotten. The satisfaction of shared effort, the comfort of mutual understanding, and the quiet joy of being useful to someone who truly appreciated him. During one particularly sunny afternoon, Margaret invited Ethan to sit with her on the porch. After they had finished repairing a section of the garden fence, the wind carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh soil, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting playful shadows across the wooden boards. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply watched the world around them, enjoying the calm together. Ethan broke the silence first. "I never thought living here would feel alive," he admitted. "I came to escape everything, but somehow, being near you, watching your garden, listening to the birds, it feels like I'm part of something again." Margaret's eyes softened. "Life has a way of surprising us," she said gently. "Sometimes we think we need to be alone, but what we really need is someone who reminds us that we can still be part of the world, even after it has taken so much from us." Her words struck Ethan deeply. He realized that he had been isolating himself not only from others, but also from the possibility of hope. Watching Margaret manage her life with dignity and quiet strength had reminded him that resilience was not about never feeling pain. It was about continuing to live despite the pain. As the weeks passed, their conversations grew longer and more personal. Margaret shared stories of her husband not in sorrow, but in fond remembrance, describing the life they had built together and the lessons she had learned from him. Ethan, in turn, began to open up about his own past. Not every detail, but enough to let Margaret see the man behind the quiet exterior. He spoke of his failures, his regrets, and the emptiness he had felt before coming to the shack. She listened without judgment, offering only gentle encouragement and understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret invited Ethan to help her prepare a simple dinner. They gathered vegetables from the garden, chopped and prepared them together, and shared stories as they cooked. There was a rhythm to their actions, a silent understanding that words alone could not capture. Ethan felt a sense of belonging he had not known in years. In that small kitchen, with the scent of fresh herbs and simmering vegetables, he realized that life could still hold warmth, laughter, and companionship. Ethan also began to notice the small ways in which Margaret had changed his perspective. She had a habit of finding beauty in ordinary moments, watching a butterfly land on a flower, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, or pausing to enjoy a quiet sunset. He found himself adopting similar habits, taking time to notice the small joys around him, appreciating moments he would have once overlooked. Margaret had not forced him to change. She had simply lived her life fully, and he had learned to do the same. One rainy afternoon, when the rain fell softly against the windows and the sky was gray, Margaret invited Ethan to help her move some firewood inside to keep it dry. The task was simple, yet the act of working together in the warm, cozy space of her home felt comforting and intimate in a way that neither had expected. They laughed quietly when a log slipped from Ethan's hands, and Margaret teased him gently, her laughter light and melodic. It was a sound that lingered in Ethan's mind long after the rain had stopped. Through these small, shared experiences, Ethan began to feel a subtle but profound shift within himself. The walls he had built around his heart were slowly coming down, brick by brick. He no longer felt the same heavy weight of solitude that had pressed upon him when he first arrived at the shack. He began to realize that life was not meant to be lived in complete isolation, that connection, even in small, ordinary ways, was essential to healing. Ethan also began to understand the quiet strength of Margaret's character. She had endured loss and loneliness, yet she had not allowed bitterness or despair to take over her life. She found joy in the little things, and she had created a life that was rich in meaning despite the hardships. Watching her navigate each day with patience and care inspired Ethan to reconsider his own approach to life. He realized that he had been too focused on escaping pain rather than learning to live alongside it. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the clouds drift across the sky, Ethan found himself speaking more freely than he had in years. He told Margaret about his childhood dreams, his hopes for the future, and the regrets that had weighed heavily on him. She listened quietly, nodding occasionally, her presence steady and reassuring. In that moment, Ethan felt a deep sense of relief, as if a burden he had carried for years was finally lifting. He realized that sharing his story with someone who truly understood was a form of healing he had not anticipated. By the end of the month, Ethan and Margaret had established a comfortable rhythm of companionship. They did not need to speak constantly. Their presence alone was enough. Ethan had begun to feel a renewed sense of purpose, not just in caring for himself and his shack, but in being a part of Margaret's life as well. He discovered that helping her, listening to her, and simply being present offered him a sense of fulfillment he had thought was lost forever. The days continued in this gentle, unhurried way. Ethan woke with the sun, worked on his shack, walked through the fields, and spent quiet afternoons with Margaret tending to the garden or preparing simple meals. He felt a growing sense of gratitude for the small, ordinary moments that had once seemed insignificant. Each interaction, each shared task, and each conversation added layers to his understanding of life, connection, and resilience. Ethan also noticed changes in himself that went beyond his daily routines. He laughed more easily, smiled more often, and found himself looking forward to the next encounter with Margaret. He realized that he was no longer merely surviving. He was beginning to live again. The shack, which had once been a refuge from life, was now a place where he could experience growth, healing, and connection. Margaret had become a gentle guide, showing him that life could still hold meaning and joy, even after years of loss and isolation. As spring began to settle into the countryside, bringing new life to the fields and forests, Ethan felt a sense of renewal he had not known in years. The sun warmed his face, the breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers, and the gentle hum of life surrounded him. In Margaret's quiet, steady presence, he had found a companion who reminded him that life was worth embracing, that connection was essential, and that even in the aftermath of loss, hope could take root and grow. Ethan had come to the shack to bury his past, to isolate himself from the world, and to find peace in solitude. But through Margaret, he had discovered that solitude was not enough. Life required interaction, understanding, and the quiet companionship of another soul. She had not demanded anything from him. She had simply lived her life, and in doing so had reminded him that it was possible to heal, to hope, and to begin again. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across the fields and turning the sky a soft shade of gold, Ethan sat on the porch beside Margaret, feeling the gentle stirrings of something he thought he had lost forever, the courage to live fully again. He did not yet know what the future held, but for the first time in many years, he felt ready to embrace it. Ethan had grown comfortable in the rhythm of his life at the shack. The days had a steady pace, morning walks along the stream, small repairs to the shack, tending to his own little garden, and afternoons spent with Margaret in her yard. Over time, her quiet presence had begun to feel like a balm on his weary heart. Life, which had once seemed gray and hopeless, now carried subtle colors, the soft hues of possibility. He had started to laugh quietly again, to feel lighter, and even to think about things he had long thought impossible, like reconnecting with the world he had abandoned. But the past, Ethan realized, had a way of finding him, no matter how far he ran. One late afternoon, as he was stacking firewood near the shack, a letter arrived. It was from his sister, a woman he had not spoken to in years. The envelope carried an urgency that made his chest tighten before he even opened it. Inside, she wrote about their father's health, mentioning that he wanted to see Ethan if he had the strength to travel. She also hinted at unresolved matters in his old home, small reminders of debts, responsibilities, and connections he had chosen to leave behind. Ethan sat on the edge of his porch, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. For the first time in weeks, the familiar weight of anxiety returned. He had built walls around himself, thinking solitude was the only path to peace, yet here was a sudden pull back to a life he had tried to leave behind. The shack, which had been a sanctuary, suddenly felt fragile, as if it might not protect him from the storm of emotions that were rising again. That evening, he found himself wandering toward Margaret's porch, unsure whether he needed comfort, advice, or merely the quiet presence of someone who understood. Margaret noticed his hesitation as he approached and smiled softly. "You seem troubled," she said, setting down a basket of fresh vegetables she had picked. Ethan sighed, the words catching in his throat. "It's my past," he admitted. "It's not just something I left behind. Sometimes it finds me, even here. I came to the shack to escape it, but now I realize it's still a part of me." Margaret nodded, her eyes kind and patient. "You can't erase the past," she said gently, "but you can choose how to live with it. Running doesn't help. Facing it, understanding it, that's what allows you to move forward." Her words hit him with the force of truth. He had spent so long hiding from the world, from relationships, from responsibilities, and even from himself. He had imagined that the shack could be a tomb for his old life, a place to bury mistakes, regrets, and failures. But now he understood that life could not be paused. It had to be faced, even if it was painful. Over the next few days, Ethan wrestled with the decision of what to do. Part of him wanted to ignore the letter, to bury it deep in the shack and continue living in the quiet world he had created with Margaret. Another part of him felt the pull of responsibility, the knowledge that avoiding the past indefinitely would only leave him restless and incomplete. Each morning he walked along the stream, thinking about what it meant to confront the people and situations he had avoided for so long. Each night he sat on his porch, staring at the stars, wondering if he was strong enough to face the consequences of his own choices. Margaret, aware of his inner struggle, offered quiet support without pressing him. She shared stories of her own life, of grief she had faced when her husband passed, of moments she had feared she would never overcome. She spoke of small steps she had taken to reclaim her life, like maintaining her garden, keeping up the house, and allowing herself to find joy in simple daily routines. Ethan listened closely, drawing strength from her example. If she could endure and rebuild, perhaps he could too. The turning point came one afternoon when a sudden storm swept through the countryside. Rain poured down in sheets. Thunder rolled in the distance, and the wind rattled the shack's old windows. Ethan had been outside, checking the roof for leaks, and he realized with a start that he had neglected the repairs he knew were urgent. Water was beginning to seep in, and the thought of letting the shack be damaged, his sanctuary, however fragile, filled him with panic. He rushed inside, grabbing buckets and tarps to stop the leaks, working furiously while the rain battered the walls. Exhausted and soaked, he paused to catch his breath and realize something. He was alive, really alive, and he had the power to protect and build something he cared about. That rush of urgency, that need to act and solve problems, reminded him that he could no longer remain passive in his own life. Life demanded engagement, even when it was messy, difficult, and unpredictable. After the storm passed, Ethan found Margaret waiting on her porch, a warm cup of tea in her hands. "You look like you've wrestled with the weather and won," she said, her voice gentle but her eyes conveying understanding. Ethan smiled, a little sheepishly. "I suppose I did. And I realized I can't keep running from what's waiting for me. I can't bury my past forever. I have to face it, even if it's hard." Margaret nodded, placing a hand lightly on his arm. "And you won't have to face it alone," she said.
You have the strength to take the first step, and sometimes that's all it takes to start living fully again.
In the days that followed, Ethan made the decision to reach out to his sister. He wrote back explaining that he would come to see their father and that he wanted to try to mend what had been broken. It was not an easy decision. The weight of old grievances, mistakes, and unresolved conflicts pressed on him. Yet, for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose. He was not fleeing from life or hiding in isolation. He was taking responsibility, however painful, for the life he had lived and the connections he had left behind. Throughout this time, Margaret remained a steady presence. She did not lecture him or try to fix his problems. She simply offered companionship and understanding. They continued their shared tasks, gardening, preparing meals, small repairs, but now their moments together carried a new depth. Ethan felt supported, encouraged, and quietly challenged to become the man he had always hoped to be. Her influence was subtle but powerful, reminding him that life, while sometimes difficult and unfair, also held moments of beauty, kindness, and connection worth striving for. Ethan's departure to visit his family approached, and the shack felt different than it had when he first arrived. It was no longer merely a refuge from the world. It had become a place where he had confronted himself, faced his fears, and begun to heal. The skills he had regained, the confidence he had rebuilt, and the lessons he had learned from Margaret would accompany him on this next step. The morning of his departure, Margaret came to see him off. She did not offer advice or warnings, only a quiet smile and a small bundle of fresh herbs from her garden. "For the journey," she said simply. "And remember, living fully means facing what comes, not hiding from it." Ethan felt a surge of gratitude. He realized how much he had relied on her presence, how her quiet strength had helped him find his own. He nodded, feeling both nervous and ready, knowing that the road ahead would be challenging, but that he was no longer alone in spirit. The journey back to his family's home was filled with reflection. As the familiar roads and towns passed by, Ethan thought about the years he had spent avoiding responsibility, the opportunities he had ignored, and the relationships he had neglected. Yet he also thought about the weeks spent at the shack, the small victories, and the connection he had formed with Margaret. He realized that life's challenges were not something to fear. They were a chance to grow, to rebuild, and to find meaning. When he arrived at his father's house, the emotions he felt were complex. There was anxiety, uncertainty, and fear of judgment. But there was also determination, the quiet strength that had begun to grow within him during his time at the shack. He understood that he could not change the past, but he could face it with honesty and courage, and that made all the difference. Over the following days, Ethan engaged in conversations he had long avoided, reconciled small misunderstandings, and began the slow process of rebuilding connections. Each step was not easy, but he felt grounded in a way he had not before. The lessons he had learned, the value of facing life directly, the strength found in quiet companionship, and the courage to embrace responsibility guided him in every interaction. By the end of his visit, Ethan felt a sense of peace he had not thought possible. He had faced the past, begun mending relationships, and realized that life, with all its challenges, could still be lived fully. As he prepared to return to the shack, he understood that the journey of healing was ongoing, but that he was now equipped with the tools and the mindset to continue. Margaret's influence, the quiet strength she had shared, and the lessons of resilience he had absorbed were now a permanent part of him. Ethan returned to the shack not as a man running from life, but as someone choosing to live again, fully aware of the past, but ready to embrace the future. And as the sun set over the fields, casting golden light across the land, Ethan realized that he had finally taken the step that mattered most. He had faced his past, embraced responsibility, and discovered the courage to live fully once more. Ethan returned to the shack with a sense of quiet triumph. The journey to face his past had been difficult, filled with moments of uncertainty and self-doubt. Yet each step he had taken, reconnecting with his family, confronting old regrets, and accepting the truth of his choices, had strengthened him. He arrived back at the countryside feeling lighter, not because the past had vanished, but because he had made peace with it. The shack, once a refuge from the world, now felt like a home he could fully inhabit, a place where he could continue living with purpose and hope. Margaret was waiting for him on her porch when he arrived. She greeted him with the same warm smile that had comforted him from the very first day. "Welcome back," she said softly, her eyes sparkling with quiet joy. "I hope your journey gave you what you needed." Ethan nodded, feeling gratitude swell in his chest. "It did," he admitted. "It was not easy, but I feel stronger now. I understand things differently. I'm ready to move forward, not just exist, but truly live." Margaret's smile widened and she reached out to lightly touch his arm. "I've always believed that life has a way of showing us what we need when the time is right," she said. "Sometimes it takes facing the hard things to find the good ones." In the days that followed, Ethan settled back into life at the shack with a renewed sense of purpose. He maintained the routines he had established, tending to his garden, repairing parts of the shack, and taking long walks. But now he also allowed himself to dream again. These dreams were smaller, more realistic than the grand ambitions of his youth, but they were vibrant and full of life. He thought about expanding the garden, fixing the porch so it could host visitors, and even learning skills he had neglected for years, like cooking and woodworking. Each day brought a sense of accomplishment and quiet satisfaction. Margaret became a constant presence in these daily routines, not because he needed her to guide him, but because their companionship had grown naturally, like two rivers converging into one. Together they planted flowers and vegetables, sharing knowledge and laughter. They prepared meals side by side, and sometimes simply sat on their porches, watching the sunlight drift through the trees. The simplicity of these activities, which had once seemed ordinary, now carried deep meaning. Ethan realized that the strength of human connection did not always come from dramatic moments, but from shared, gentle experiences that built trust and understanding over time. One afternoon, as they worked together to repair a section of Margaret's garden fence, Ethan paused to take in the scene. The sun was warm, the breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, and the fields stretched endlessly into the distance. He looked at Margaret, who was carefully aligning a wooden plank, and felt a wave of gratitude, not just for her guidance or companionship, but for the reminder she had given him. Life was worth living, even after loss. even after heartbreak. Her quiet resilience had shown him that happiness could exist alongside grief, and that it was possible to rebuild a life without erasing the past. Over the following weeks, Ethan found himself reconnecting not only with Margaret, but also with the world around him. He noticed the songs of birds he had once ignored, the subtle patterns of sunlight across the trees, and the gentle flow of the stream near his shack. Each observation became a small celebration of life, a reminder that beauty existed in every corner of the world if one took the time to notice it. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for these simple pleasures, and for the person who had quietly guided him back to them. As summer approached, Ethan and Margaret began planning small projects for the shack and the garden. They repaired the old porch together, creating a space where friends or neighbors could visit and enjoy the tranquility of the countryside. They planted new flowers along the paths, adding bursts of color that reflected the renewal Ethan felt inside. These projects were not just tasks, they were symbols of growth, collaboration, and the hope that life could be both purposeful and joyful. Ethan also began thinking more seriously about his relationships outside the countryside. He reached out to old friends he had lost touch with, reconnecting in ways that were meaningful and supportive. He wrote letters, made phone calls, and occasionally traveled short distances to visit people he had once cared for but had neglected. Each step strengthened his sense of belonging, and he discovered that the world he had once feared and avoided could be a source of joy rather than only pain. Margaret's example had taught him that connection was not a weakness. It was the lifeblood of living fully. One quiet evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ethan and Margaret sat on the repaired porch, sipping warm tea. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers and fresh earth, and the gentle hum of insects and birds surrounded them. Ethan realized that he had not only rebuilt the shack and garden, but also his own heart. The walls he had constructed around himself over years of grief and regret had softened, replaced by trust, hope, and the willingness to embrace life fully. Margaret looked at him, a knowing smile on her face. "You've come a long way," she said softly. "It's not just the shack or the garden. It's you. You've allowed yourself to live again." Ethan nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deeply within him. "I couldn't have done it alone," he admitted. You reminded me that life is worth living, even after loss. That connection, small as it may seem, can change everything." Their companionship deepened, built on shared experiences, mutual respect, and a growing understanding of each other's strengths and vulnerabilities. They did not need constant conversation or dramatic declarations. Their presence together was enough. Whether tending the garden, repairing the shack, or simply sitting quietly in the evening light, Ethan felt a sense of belonging he had long thought impossible. Margaret had taught him that life could be simple, steady, and fulfilling if one was willing to engage fully, without fear. As autumn approached, Ethan reflected on how much he had changed. He was no longer the man who had arrived at the shack burdened by past regrets and a desire to hide from the world. He had faced his past, reconnected with family and friends, and discovered the strength to embrace life. The shack, once a refuge from pain, had become a home filled with possibility, growth, and quiet joy. Margaret, the widow next door, had been the gentle catalyst for this transformation, her life and presence a mirror that reflected what he could become. Together, they began planning small events to share the beauty of the countryside with others. They invited neighbors for tea, helped local children learn about gardening, and even assisted travelers who passed by the area. Ethan realized that his life had expanded beyond the walls of the shack. He was no longer hiding, no longer merely surviving. He was participating in the world, building connections, and contributing to the lives of others. Each act, no matter how small, reinforced the sense of purpose and fulfillment that had been missing for so long. Ethan also began dreaming about the future in ways he had not dared to before. He imagined maintaining the shack and garden as a lasting home, a place where both he and Margaret could continue growing, learning, and sharing life. He thought about the possibility of taking small trips to visit family and friends, to experience new places, and to bring back stories and memories to enrich their quiet corner of the countryside. These dreams, grounded yet vibrant, reflected the transformation within him, the shift from fear and isolation to hope and engagement. One evening, as winter approached and the first frost began to settle on the fields, Ethan and Margaret sat together on the porch, wrapped in warm blankets. The sky was clear and the stars shone brightly, casting a soft glow over the land. Ethan looked at the woman who had quietly changed his life and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and affection. She had not rushed him, nor had she judged him for his past. She had simply existed, living her life fully, and in doing so had shown him the way to live fully as well. "I never imagined life could feel like this again," Ethan said quietly. "I thought I would always be running from the past, hiding in solitude. But now I feel alive. I feel ready to face whatever comes." Margaret smiled, her eyes warm and steady. "That's the beauty of life," she said. "It doesn't matter what has happened before. What matters is the choice to live fully, to embrace the present, and to let yourself grow. You've done that, Ethan. You've truly chosen life again." Ethan looked around the fields, the shack, and the garden they had nurtured together. Everything felt alive, vibrant, and full of promise. He understood that life would not always be easy. There would be challenges, sorrows, and setbacks, but he was no longer afraid. He had the strength, the wisdom, and the companionship needed to navigate whatever came next. And in that moment, as the stars sparkled above and the gentle hum of the countryside filled the air, Ethan realized something profound. He had not only rediscovered life, but he had also discovered himself. The shack, once a place to bury his past, had become a sanctuary of hope, growth, and renewal. Margaret, the quiet widow next door, had shown him that even after loss, even after hardship, life could still be beautiful, meaningful, and full of connection. Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. Together they would continue to build a life filled with laughter, friendship, and purpose. The shack was no longer a refuge from the world. It was a home, a place of healing and joy, and a symbol of the courage it took to face the past and embrace the future. As winter settled into the countryside, Ethan sat on the porch beside Margaret, sipping tea and watching the frost glisten on the fields. For the first time in years, he felt complete, not because life had been perfect, but because he had chosen to live fully, to embrace connection, and to welcome each day as it came. And with Margaret by his side, he knew that no matter what the future held, he would never again face it alone.